The histories, the dominance, the legacies, the powerhouses. The Auburn Tigers and the Alabama Crimson Tide of the Southeastern Conference are the two programs most people think of when asked about football in Alabama. Both have climbed to the top of the college football world and gazed off the summit. They have known gridiron greatness and unparalleled victories. In this video, we will examine and recount the greatest triumphs of these long, storied football programs. The Auburn Tigers were founded in 1882, tying them for the oldest still active program in Alabama. The Tigers play at Jordan-Hare Stadium. The venue completed construction in 1939 and has been home of Auburn football ever since. The capacity sits at over 80,000 spectators. It has been renovated and expanded several times over its life. The namesake for the stadium is Ralph "Shug" Jordan and Cliff Hare. Cliff Hare was on the first team ever fielded by Auburn, and then went on to serve as chair of the Auburn Faculty Athletic Committee. Jordan would be the head coach who led Auburn to its first national championship in 1957. Auburn has had 16 conference championships over its long history. The Tigers joined the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association, their first conference, in 1895 after being independent for 13 years. They would stay with the SIAA until 1920, during which time they claimed 7 conference titles. 6 of those would come under the leadership of Mike Donahue. Donahue was the first great coach for Auburn, and when he left Auburn in 1920, he had a winning record of 106, 35, and 5. His winning percentage was an impressive .743. In 1921, Auburn would move to the Southern Conference, or SoCon. They would only win one conference championship in 1932, which was their last season in SoCon. In 1933, Auburn would arrive as a founding member of the SEC and have remained there for over 90 years. They have won 8 conference championships in the SEC. Their last would come in 2013 under head coach Gus Malzahn, when the Tigers beat the Mizzou Tigers 59-42. Auburn has won 2 national titles. Their first, as mentioned before, was won in 1957 under head coach Ralph "Shug" Jordan, who was in his 7th season. The 57 Tigers would go undefeated in 10 games, including a 40-0 win over their in-state rival, Alabama. The star player on the team was wide receiver Jimmy Phillips, who was a consensus first-team pick on the All-America college football team. He would go on to have a successful career in the NFL for 10 seasons, making multiple Pro Bowls while with the Rams. Ralph Jordan had a long tenure at Auburn, coaching the Tigers from 1951 to 1975. The aforementioned 1957 season would be his best. In 1973, the then-named Cliff Hare Stadium would be renamed to Jordan-Hare Stadium. His overall record with Auburn was 145 wins, 83 losses, and 7 ties when he retired. The next national championship was held in 2010. Head coach Gene Chizik was at the helm, and in his 2nd season, star quarterback Cam Newton would lead the team on the field. They would go undefeated with a 14-0 record. The Tigers won the SEC by defeating South Carolina in the championship game in a dominating 56-17 victory. In the national championship game held in Arizona, the Auburn Tigers would face off against the Oregon Ducks. The game began with a surprising 3 turnovers in the first quarter, 2 by Oregon and 1 by Auburn. Both teams had demonstrated powerful offenses throughout the year, but this game was a defensive battle. In the waning seconds of the 4th quarter, Auburn would send out the kicker Wes Byram to knock through a walk-off field goal and defeat the Oregon Ducks in a tight contest 22-19. Gene Chizik would only lead the Tigers for 4 seasons, from 2009 to 2012. After his national championship, his offensive coordinator Gus Malzahn would leave to go coach at Arkansas State for the 2012 season. Auburn would face a sharp decline over that year, with the 2012 season ending with 3 wins and 9 losses. It was suspected the true success of Chizik was actually due to Malzahn. Chizik would be fired, and Gus would take his place as head coach of the Tigers in 2013. Chizik would have an overall record at Auburn of 38 wins and 19 losses. Auburn has had 3 Heisman Trophy winners, tying them for 6th place for the most winners along with 7 other schools. Their first was quarterback Pat Sullivan, who won it in 1971. The Alabama native threw for 2,012 yards and 20 touchdowns and led his 71 team to a 9-2 record. He would also win the Walter Camp Award and be a unanimous All-American. After his time at Auburn, he would be drafted in the 2nd round by the Atlanta Falcons and be in the league for 6 seasons. Once he retired from the sport, he coached at Auburn, UAB, TCU, and Samford in various roles. He would win a conference championship as head coach in 2013 with Samford before retiring the next year. The second winner is none other than Bo Jackson. Jackson would win the award in 1985, rushing for an astonishing 1,786 yards and 17 touchdowns. The Tigers would go 8-4 that year despite coming into the year ranked at number 1. Jackson would win a myriad of other awards including the Walter Camp and would be a unanimous All-American. He would be drafted by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with the number 1 overall pick, but he would never play a down for them. Basically, Jackson had unknowingly broken NCAA and SEC rules by visiting the Bucs while he was still playing baseball, his other great love. He believed he had been tricked in losing out to finish his season and vowed never to play for the organization. Eventually, he'd be drafted in the '87 draft by the Raiders. He would only play 4 seasons before a hip injury forced him to retire. For me, Bo is a major what if for a pro player. He had good numbers in his limited play over his NFL career. If he had focused purely on the game instead of splitting time with baseball, he might have been one of the greatest of all time. 2010 would see the third of the Auburn Heismans in star quarterback Cam Newton. The Tigers would go undefeated that year and would win the national championship. Cam threw for 2,539 yards and 28 passing touchdowns, and rushed for 1,409 yards and 20 touchdowns during the season. In the Iron Bowl, Newton led the Tigers back from a 24-point deficit to beat Alabama 28-27. So dominant was Newton that aside from the Heisman, he won every major award which could be given to a quarterback. He'd be drafted number 1 overall in 2011 by the Carolina Panthers. In 2015, he would have his best season and make a trip to the Super Bowl. He would have the most successful career out of the 3 Auburn Heisman Trophy winners, playing in the league for 11 seasons. I feel I would be remiss if I did not talk about the Deep South's oldest rivalry between Georgia and Auburn. These 2 storied teams have been playing each other almost every year for the last 132 years since the very beginning. The only circumstances which have stopped them from playing each other was war and death. Currently, Georgia leads the rivalry over Auburn with a record of 64 wins for the Bulldogs, 56 wins for the Tigers, and 8 ties. Georgia also has the longest win streak at 9 between the years of 1923 to 1931. However, if Auburn does not do something fast, that record will be beaten in the coming years, as Georgia currently holds a 7-win streak. The current head coach as of 2024 is Hugh Freeze, who finished his first season with the Auburn Tigers with a 6-7 record. Auburn is a historic program with an impressive story spanning well over a century, full of insane moments, star players, and spectacular coaches who will be remembered as long as ball is played on the gridiron. But now we travel to the west, across the state, to Auburn's major in-state rival. The Alabama Crimson Tide was founded in 1892 and has fostered a legacy of greatness. The Tide plays football at Saban Field at Bryant-Denny Stadium in Tuscaloosa. The stadium was built in 1929 and originally had a capacity of 12,000. It has been expanded multiple times over its long history and is now the largest stadium in the state, seating 100,077 people. This makes it the 10th largest in the world. The stadium is named after Paul Bear Bryant and George H. Denny. Denny was the president of the university from 1912 to 1936 before retiring. The field itself is named after head coach Nick Saban as of 2024. Across the century, Alabama has won 34 conference championships. In 1896, Alabama would join its first conference in the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association. They joined the Southern Conference, or SoCon, in 1921 and won 4 conference championships during their short time there. These were all won by head coach Wallace Wade, the first great Alabama head coach. Wade would also win 3 national championships during his tenure in 1925, 1926, and 1930. In 1932, Alabama was a founding member of the Southeastern Conference. They have won the SEC championship 30 times, the most of any school within the division. The next head coach to lead the Crimson Tide to more championships was Frank Thomas. Thomas would add 2 titles in 1934 and 1941. The 34 season was a perfect 10-win record. Alabama, through a stalwart defense, crushed most of its competition, hanging 30 points or more while not giving up any in 4 of the 10 contests. They would defeat Stanford in the Rose Bowl, 29-31. The 1941 season championship is controversial. The Tide would go 9-2 with losses to Mississippi State and Vandy. They would win the Cotton Bowl by beating number 9 Texas A&M 29-21. The reason we claim it is through the Holgate system, which is recognized by the NCAA and ranks teams' performances by strength of schedule via mathematical scale. Minnesota seems to be the chosen champion, but only played 8 games, winning all of them, and not playing a bowl game. Bama played 11 games, including a bowl game. But if it is good enough for the NCAA, then it's good enough for me. Bart Starr is who I would consider the first Alabama QB to go on to be an NFL great. Although he was not amazing at Bama due to controversy and injury, his NFL career was legendary. He was named NFL MVP in 1966, and he led the Green Bay Packers to Super Bowls 1 and 2, winning both in 67 and 68. Alabama would go through a 20-year championship drought, and between the years of 1955 to 57, they would win only 4 games, including the only winless season for the Tide in 1955. However, in 1958, the university hired a man who would set the standard and become a legend. Paul Bear Bryant was hired away from Texas A&M and would win his first national championship in his 4th season in 1961 with an undefeated record of 11-0, winning the Sugar Bowl against Arkansas. 1964 would be the Bears' second championship, with star quarterback Joe Namath under center and finishing 10-1 with a single loss coming from Texas in the Orange Bowl. Back then, the AP poll posted their last poll results before bowl season, which had Bama at number 1. Broadway Joe would be picked number 1 overall by the New York Jets in the AFL draft and go on to win Super Bowl III. Bryant and the Tide would go back-to-back, winning the national championship again in 1965. They would go 9-1-1, with the one loss being a close one to Georgia, 18-17 in the season opener, and tying Tennessee 7-7 in the middle of the season. Bama would defeat Nebraska in the Orange Bowl, 39-28. Bama legend Ken Stabler played QB for the 65 team, but only as a backup. He did post an undefeated season the following year, going 11-0, but Bama was snubbed in polling and denied a 3rd national championship in a row. The playoff system may not be perfect, but it is better than what we had back then. Stabler would go on to be drafted 52nd overall in 1968 by the Oakland Raiders. He was named NFL MVP in 1974 and won Super Bowl XI in 76. Ken would be the last Alabama QB to win a Super Bowl. The 1973 season would see Bryant's 4th championship at Alabama, posting a record of 11-1 and a sweep of the SEC. The one loss came in the Sugar Bowl in a close contest against number 3 Notre Dame, the final score being 24-23. Bama gets a championship because the final coaches poll ranked Bama at number 1 before bowl season. The Associated Press's final poll would come out after bowl season, giving the title to Notre Dame. After this year, the coaches poll would release their final polls after bowl season. In 1975, Denny Stadium would be renamed to Bryant-Denny Stadium. In 1978, his 21st season, Bear would win his 5th championship. The Tide would post an 11-1 record. The lone loss came from the USC Trojans early in the season, which saw Bama drop to number 7 in the rankings. Alabama, over the course of the rest of the season, would claw back to number 2, where they would face off against Penn State in the Sugar Bowl. The game would be a nail-biter, with the defenses standing tall for both sides. Bama would go up by 7 late in the third and hold the lead to the bitter end, winning 14-7. Bryant's 6th and last championship would be his most convincing, going 12-0 in 1979. Bama would start the year at number 2 and flip to 1 after USC tied Stanford, and then back to 2 with Ohio State taking the spot. The closest game would be a 3-0 win over LSU in the Bayou. In the Sugar Bowl, Alabama would face off against number 6 Arkansas and win 24-9. Ohio State, who still held the number 1 ranking, would lose to the number 3 USC Trojans 17-16 in the Rose Bowl. In the final polls, Alabama, with a perfect record, would move to number 1 and take its 11th total championship. The 1982 season would be the Bears' last as a head coach. He would post a modest 8-4 record, with 3 losses coming in the SEC, seeing many winning streaks come to an end over Tennessee, LSU, and Auburn. Bama would beat Illinois 21-15 in the Liberty Bowl, allowing a legend in college football to go out on a win. Bear would retire after the game, and on January 26, 1983, less than a month later, he would pass away at age 69. Paul Bear Bryant set the standard for Alabama football and forged a legacy of greatness. During his 25-year tenure as head coach, he would post a record of 232 wins, 46 losses, and 9 ties, making him the winningest coach in Alabama history, and never had a losing season. He led Bama to 6 national titles and 13 SEC championships. He would win the American Football College Association Coach of the Year 3 times, and the SEC Coach of the Year 11 times, with the Tide. Bear's impact was so widespread in the public's eye that he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and during Super Bowl XVII, which was played 4 days after his death, there was held a moment of silence in his honor. Today, Paul Bear Bryant has a statue of himself outside the stadium, which bears his name. Following the Bear would be tough, and neither of the next 2 head coaches survived more than 3 years, until 1990, when Alabama hired Gene Stallings. In 1992, Stallings would lead his team to his one and only title, and the first for Bama in over a decade. Boasting a stout defense, the Tide finished with a perfect 13-0 season. Florida would challenge the Tide for the SEC championship, but Bama would win in a close battle 28-21. They would go on to defeat the number 1 ranked Miami Hurricanes 34-13 in the Sugar Bowl. Stallings would win both the AFCA and SEC Coach of the Year awards. Stallings would have a good career at Alabama for the next several seasons, but would never reach the same heights. During the 1995 season, the program was marred by scandal concerning Hootie Ingram and Antonio Langham, as they both broke NCAA rules. Bama was found guilty and received punishments. Stallings would resign during the 96 season following an Iron Bowl win. His actions, such as promoting Mike DuBose before resigning, would put a strain on Bama football for the next 15 years. Stallings would finish at Bama with 70 wins, 16 losses, and 1 tie. This period in Alabama's history is rife with disappointment and strife. Between 1997 and 2006, Alabama would go through 4 full-time head coaches and 1 interim. Alabama has had 11 losing seasons in its more than 100-year history, and 4 of them came during this time. However, all of that was about to change. The year is 2007, and Alabama signs former Miami Dolphins head coach Nick Saban to become their next head coach. Coming into Alabama, Saban already had 1 national championship and 2 SEC championships with LSU. Saban's first championship came in 2009, where the Tide had an undefeated record of 14-0. In the Rose Bowl, number 1 ranked Alabama would face off against number 2 Texas. Bama would have a rocky start, giving up 2 turnovers in the first 6 minutes. However, during the first Texas drive, their starting QB Colt McCoy would be injured and sidelined for the game. The game would be close in the 4th, when the score was 24-21, but the running backs of Mark Ingram and Trent Richardson would score a touchdown apiece to end the game 37-21. In only 3 seasons, Nick Saban was able to turn a floundering Alabama program left broken by Mike Shula into national champions. 2009 would also see a first for the University of Alabama. Sophomore running back Mark Ingram would win the Heisman Trophy. During the season, he would rush for 1,678 yards. His best performance would come in Week 7 against South Carolina, when Ingram would rush for 246 yards on 24 attempts. After a disappointing 2010 junior season, Mark would declare for the draft and be selected 28 overall in the first round by the New Orleans Saints. He would go on to play for over a decade in the pros. The second national championship under Nick Saban would be 2 years later in 2011. The team would end the season with a 12-1 record. Their loss came from LSU in a defensive slog with a score of 9-6 in OT, and they fell to number 3. At the end of the year, Bama was back up to number 2 despite not playing in the SEC championship. LSU would obliterate Georgia 42-10, and a rematch was set between LSU and Bama in the BCS National Championship. The Crimson Tide would have their revenge by defeating the Tigers 21-0, as Alabama would literally kick them to death. Aside from a late Trent Richardson touchdown, kicker Jeremy Shelley would score 5 field goals with a long of 58 yards. It would not be long for Bama to wait for its next chance at glory, as they were back in it for the 2012 BCS National Championship. The Tide would have a 13-1 season. Its one loss came from the Johnny Manziel-led Texas A&M Aggies by a score of 29-24. Despite this, Bama would win the West and face Georgia in a close game in the SEC Championship. The Tide would prevail 32-28 thanks to a 44-yard late-game touchdown from A.J. McCarron to Amari Cooper. Bama would take the number 2 rank and go to the national championship against number 1 Notre Dame. It was not a close contest. It was a slaughter, and Bama's most convincing championship. With a balanced run game by Eddie Lacy and pass game by Cooper and McCarron, the Tide trounced the Irish 42-24, with Alabama having 35 points on the board before Notre Dame got its first score. The Bowl Championship Series came to an end in 2014 and would be replaced by the College Football Playoffs. Bama participated in the first playoffs, but came up short in an offensive shootout against Ohio State in the semifinals, losing 35-42. They would have their shot at redemption the following year in 2015. Bama would go 14-1 with an early loss to Ole Miss, mainly due to uncertainty at the QB position between Cooper Bateman and Jake Coker. However, Coker secured his position as starter, and the Tide would not look back and go undefeated for the rest of the regular season. They would enter the second year of the playoffs at number 2 and would take on number 3 Michigan State in the Cotton Bowl. The game was slow at first, with the score only being 10-0 at the half, but eventually the Tide came back roaring and eviscerated the Spartans 38-0. Alabama was now making the trip to the national championship game in Glendale, Arizona, where they would face number 1 ranked Clemson under the command of Deshaun Watson and coach Dabo Swinney, who had a week prior beaten Oklahoma 37-17 in the Orange Bowl. The game was a slugfest, with multiple lead changes and spectacular plays, but a late-game touchdown run by Derrick Henry would seal it away. Watson would go on an impressive minute-long drive and score, but the game would end 45-40. The running back Derrick Henry would become the second Tide player to hoist the Heisman Trophy. In his junior season, he would rush for an astonishing 2,219 yards and score 28 touchdowns. His best game came against rival Auburn in the Iron Bowl, where he would score 1 touchdown but gain a whopping 271 yards on the ground. He'd be drafted by the Titans in the second round of the 2015 draft and go on to earn the nickname King Henry, as he put on dominating performances and shows of incredible strength. In 2017, Nick Saban's 11th season, the Tide would go 14-1 and would be led by Jalen Hurts at quarterback. The Crimson Tide would jockey for the number 1 spot along with Georgia, but both would lose regular season games to Auburn. However, Georgia would beat Auburn in the SEC championship. Both Bama and Georgia would sneak into the playoffs at the number 4 and number 3 spots. Georgia would have a fight with Oklahoma, but defeat them in the Rose Bowl, while Alabama handily brushed aside number 1 ranked Clemson 24-6 in the Sugar Bowl. Georgia and Bama would meet in the championship game. Georgia would hold a 13-0 lead over Bama going into the half. Saban would make a change at quarterback and bring out freshman quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. Bama would battle its way back into the game and tie to send it to overtime. Georgia had the ball first and would settle for a field goal after Jake Fromm was sacked. Bama would have the ball next, but on the first play, Tua would be sacked for 16 yards. And then, well, everyone knows what happened next.
Tagovailoa trying to make up for it. Fires to the end zone. Touchdown! Alabama wins!
This would be Saban's 5th title at Bama. The 2020 season saw the start of a very bad cold for a lot of people, and this ended many sporting events from basketball to hockey to the closure of the second iteration of the XFL. However, college football would not be stopped. Alabama, led by quarterback Mac Jones, running back Najee Harris, and wide receiver Devonta Smith, would compete in a 10-game All-SEC schedule and go undefeated with an overall record of 13-0. Bama dominated most of its competition with a stellar offense and stout, unbreakable defense, and its toughest match was in the SEC Championship against Florida, but the Tide would win a shootout 52-46. In the playoff semifinal, Alabama would face Notre Dame and win 31-14. They advanced to the championship game and would be confronted by the Ohio State Buckeyes, led by quarterback Justin Fields. The game would be a tight contest going into the second quarter, but Alabama would run wild, scoring 28 points in the second. Both teams would go into the locker room with Alabama leading 35-17. Ohio State would only score once more in the third, but Bama would get an additional 17 points before the clock hit 0, the ending score being 52-24. Even though Devonta Smith did not play much of the second half due to a hand injury, he would get game MVP honors for catching 3 touchdowns and gaining 215 yards. It was a big year for select Bama players, as running back Najee Harris would finish 5th in Heisman voting, and Mac Jones would finish 3rd. But it would be Devonta Smith who would claim the honors over Clemson quarterback Trevor Lawrence, becoming the 3rd player to receive the Heisman. This was the first time since 1992 that a wide receiver would win the award. Smith would post an impressive 1,856 yards receiving and score 23 touchdowns. He would be selected 10th overall by the Eagles and assisted them in going to Super Bowl 57 in 2022. So far, he has had a promising start in his first 3 seasons in Philly. The 2021 season would be another dominant performance by the Tide, led by quarterback Bryce Young, winning the SEC, but they would fall short during the national championship against Georgia, losing 33-17. Bryce Young would be the 4th Crimson Tide player to earn the Heisman Trophy and the first QB. He would pass for 4,872 yards and score 47 touchdowns to only 7 interceptions. In the 2023 draft, Young would be the first Alabama player to ever go number 1 overall to the Carolina Panthers. He is going into his 2nd year after a disappointing first year. 2023 saw Bama struggle by their standards and would finish 12-2. Quarterback Jalen Milroe was tasked with leading the team, but the QB competition lasted well into Week 3, following a loss at home to Texas and a poor performance against South Florida. However, this team persevered, and despite many close shaves, they would defeat the current reigning champion of Georgia in the SEC Championship 27-24. However, they would fail to beat Michigan in the Rose Bowl 27-20. After the 2023 season, head coach Nick Saban, at the age of 72, would retire from coaching, concluding a 17-season run with the Alabama Crimson Tide. During his tenure with Alabama, he would lead the Tide to 6 national championships and win 9 SEC championships. He boasted an overall coaching record in Tuscaloosa of 117 wins to 18 losses. He would successfully get 133 Bama players drafted, and 47 of them were in the first round. Nick Saban is the greatest coach in college football of all time, and he simply achieved excellence. With Nick Saban retiring, Alabama needed a new head coach, and they found it in Washington coach Kalen DeBoer, who had just come off a national championship appearance with the Huskies. 2024 will be his first season, and we will see how he succeeds in following a legend. The Iron Bowl rivalry between Alabama and Auburn is one of the most intense battles in all of sports. Every year is a fight, and it does not matter if one team is undefeated and the other has a losing record, both will bring their A game. The first meeting was well over 120 years ago in 1893, where Auburn won 32-22. They would compete for 12 years until 1907. After the 1907 game, there was a contract dispute over $34, which ended the game's renewal. The Iron Bowl would go on hiatus for the next 4 decades until it returned in 1948 and has been going ever since. There have been countless big moments, such as the run in the mud, bow over the top, the kick 6 and 4th and 31. The highest scoring game was in 2014, an Alabama victory, with a score of 55-44, totaling 99 points. The Tigers and the Tide have met 88 times in their history. Bama leads the series with 50 wins to Auburn's 37 and 1 tie. The longest win streak belongs to Bama, with 9 wins between the years of 1973 to 1981. The longest streak for Auburn was 6 between 2002 to 2007. No matter the year, we can always expect a crazy and entertaining game between these two SEC teams. It is intense, it is competitive, it is a grand rivalry. It is the Iron Bowl. And those were the two FBS SEC teams. This is the longest video I have made by far, and I'm happy I am finally done. Thank you for watching, and as a new small channel, a like and a comment would really make my day. Be sure to subscribe to not miss out on the final planned part of the series, the professional Alabama teams.